name's Laura Woodward-Cavers. I'm the reader advisor here at New Canaan Library. Thank you all for coming to this author talk with Russell Banks. So I just wanted to say that every once in a while we have very, very prestigious writers, and we are very, very happy that today we have one of the finest, one of the writers in America, Russell Banks. He has written over 20 books and is featured in a number of anthologies. He is also a poet. He was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and is one of the most prestigious fiction writers, a past president of the International Parliament of Writers, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His work has been translated into 20 languages and has received numerous prizes and awards. He is here tonight to discuss his latest book, Foregone, a story about famed Canadian-American documentary filmmaker Leonard Fife, one of 60,000 draft evaders and deserters who fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. Fife, now in his late 70s, is dying of cancer in Montreal and has agreed to do a final interview to bear all the secrets and betrayals of his life at last. The interview is filmed by his acolyte and ex-star student, Malcolm McLeod, in the presence of Fife's wife, Emma, and alongside Malcolm's producer, cinematographer, sound technicians, who have all long admired Fife, but who must now absorb the meaning of his astonishing, dark confession. That is what the book is all about. And I have to say, it's an amazing, deep book about memory, abandonment, and betrayal. And so to start the conversation, Russell, I have to ask, what made you want to write this story?
Well, Laura, that was a lovely, thank you. That was just a lovely synopsis, and I appreciate the setup. It was nice and it's
You're welcome.
It's and clear and accurate, all of which a writer certainly approves of and is grateful for. But your question, of course, leads me away from that and say, well, what about the sources of the book, and where did that come from? And there are many, as there are in any novel. I think for any writer, a number of sources, and some of them are not even known to the writer at the time. And maybe even now, after the book has been published, some of them are still maybe not known to me, but I can name a few and say, for instance, I was long interested in the flight of American young men, almost all white, middle class, in the late 60s, early 70s to Canada to avoid serving in the draft, or who were deserting from the military to Canada, and who were taken in by the Canadian government as refugees, not as immigrants, and who the Canadian government refused to extradite back to the Americans, despite the leverage that Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon tried to place on them in order to get them back. Treated them really as refugees from an oppressed state. And that always fascinated me, and I think for several different reasons. One is it's a relatively unwritten story and a relatively unacknowledged or known story. We forgot about it. 60,000 of them went. That's an enormous number when you think about it.
60,000 went to Canada?
Yes, and there are less, but also a significant number went to Sweden and Norway as well. But the Canadian migration, and it was almost that, was particularly interesting to me. And I think for various reasons. One is I was very active in that period as well in the anti-war movement. And so I knew many people who had done this. And I was a little older, and I was married and had children, and I wasn't eligible for the draft at that moment. And so but yet I was still very engaged in the anti-war movement at that time. And the other thing that I think affected me and generated some of my engagement with this story, long before it was a story, was that I'm Canadian American myself. And my father and three of my grandparents are Canadian, and I'm a de facto Canadian citizen with the application that is presently being considered by the Canadian government for certification, so that I'm a Canadian American myself, but much later under rather different circumstances. But nonetheless, I have lived most of my adult life on the border, either in New Hampshire, northern New England, or now in New York State on the border. And I go back and forth a lot. And so I'm very aware of the fascinating, to me at least, merger of Canadian and American culture, history, and political life as well. So all this lurked in the background. And I could say there's another couple of factors too that generated the novel. I'm 81 years old. So in writing the novel, I was reaching that point in my late 70s, and actuarial tables will tell you that I was reaching the end of my life, and so were most of my dear friends, lifelong friends. And so I was suddenly, it wasn't so sudden, but I was confronted again and again over the process of writing this novel and leading up to it, of the death of my friends, this sickness and dying of dear friends. And most of them were men, and people I had known for 40, 50 years in some cases. And I became incredibly aware of this. This is a book that I don't think I know I could not or would not even have thought to write when I was younger. It's an old man's book in many ways, a man who's very, very aware of his own mortality and the mortality of the people he loves, and is trying to figure out how to face that and deal with that. So those combination of factors, and there are others as well, kind of came together a few years ago, and when I began to think about the possibility of writing a novel that might bring these themes into one place. But I needed, of course, I needed a central character. I needed somebody whose end of life experiences might bring this all together. And it wasn't a great leap of the imagination for me to begin to consider, okay, how would I do it? How, if I had to sit down in front of a camera, or in my case, in front of a computer screen, and tell the truth, really tell the truth. And what is the truth? And how do I know? My memories are such inventions in so many ways, and so unreliable in so many ways. And so are the memories of the people who remember me. And what have I hidden from myself? What have I hidden from others? What in fact, in the end, is the truth of my own personal narrative. So in many ways, this is a very personal book for me. I've drawn more closely from my own life in some ways. Leonard Fife, the protagonist, has been married several times before he's married for a long permanent time, as it seems. And so have I. Leonard Fife has achieved a certain degree of distinction and celebrity in Canada as a leftist documentary filmmaker, an innovator, someone who is celebrated in his own world. So he's risen from a kind of working class background to an elitist kind of level of his society, and all these elements of my own life entered into the writing of this book, probably more than any book I've written up to now. Usually I've stayed away from the facts and the narrative of my own personal life. and haven't drawn too heavily on it, or much at all for that matter, at least not consciously. But in this case, I did. And I think that this is a long answer to your question, and I apologize for that. But it is the case that there are all these different threads came together about, well, 4 or 5 years ago, and then I sat around for a while, did some research. I really wanted to know the history of those Americans who went to Canada, and because it's not a well-known history, and then had to do some digging.
We have an interesting question from someone, actually from Los Angeles. He's gotten onto this author talk, and he asks a question about he's halfway through Foregone, and he's curious about, did you have any actual friendships with draft dodgers that you were using in Foregone? Did you know any of them? And
Oh, sure.
been in contact with them?
Oh, yeah, of course. And not only just draft dodgers, but also advisors on this side who worked in I don't know how far into the novel he's gotten, but he'll get to a point where there is a character who is an advisor living in the United States, teaching at a professor at Goddard College in Vermont, who is advising kids on how to get across and where to go, and then how to enter into the network of asylum that existed in Canada at the time. And I knew many people. I was in the late 60s in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and very active in the anti-war movement, and there later in New Hampshire in the 70s. And so yes, it was many people were part of my personal friendships and relationships who were faced with this confrontation. How do you deal with this? And Canada was one of the ways of dealing with it. And then I checked in later, and when working on the book, with a few other friends who themselves had experiences, had gone to Canada and been there, and who themselves had to deal with it. Yeah. So it was part and parcel of the writing, was to make sure that I was connecting all these different relationships and experiences, as well as archival research. In Canada, there's actually much more information available and archivally about the migration of the Americans to Canada than there is in the United States. There's rather little written about it. And I mean, even after Jimmy Carter became president, and the first thing he did was to pardon all the Americans who had gone to Canada, and let them come back without any punitive consequences. Only 10% of the 60,000 came back. Only 6,000 of them returned to the United States. The rest of them stayed in Canada, assimilated, became Canadians, and many of them became prominent in various professions, because after all, they were educated, most of them. They were white. They were young, and once they were there and settled in, then they made that their lives. Most of them became permanent Canadian citizens.
So for your character, Leo Fife, he became a cinematographer and a documentarian. Why choose that profession for that character? Was there a reason?
Hard to know, I didn't want to write about a writer. I think writing about writers for writers is pretty boring, and it's probably pretty boring for readers too. And I wasn't too interested in it, but I was very interested in the documentary gaze of the whole complicated net of issues that raises, morally and politically and socially, and which also, of course, fiction writers have to themselves confront and consider. But I thought, well, if I make him a documentary filmmaker, then I can make him a witness and to others, and that's how he ended up living out his career in Canada. And the parallels between that and what I think of the work of a fiction writer, that is, of the work of witness, seemed close enough, but without being the same. And so I felt free to write a book that does raise some of the issues morally and socially and politically that that writers face or should face if they don't in their own work. And so making him a documentary filmmaker was, for me, a lot more interesting than making him an accountant or a dentist or a newscaster. It seemed like, okay, he's a creative person. He's a man who's building a life and trying to imagine himself into the role of the witness, and he's going to take positions, and yet he's going to also be at the same time trying to present objective reality. These are all very familiar themes and moral quandaries and aesthetic decisions and so forth that I faced in a day-to-day way in my own writing. And it was close enough, but not too close for me to engage him on that way. I think that's maybe why I made him a document. I'm also very interested in filmmaking itself, just as such. Mm. And I've worked with a number of filmmakers over the years, and it's one of them, the most perhaps importantly, is Atta Magoyan, a Canadian filmmaker who made the film of The Sweet Hereafter. Wonderful, elegant, beautiful film, and I've worked with a couple of documentary filmmakers as well, and I'm really fascinated by the process and the techniques and the knowledge and the danger of filmmaking, and so I liked being able to engage it in the novel form.
You were referring to The Sweet Hereafter, which is a book of yours that was made into a film, and also Affliction, another novel, mm-hmm. was made into a movie as well. So you do have that knowledge of how a story is going to translate onto a screen, and so that you find that is a very interesting another way of communicating that artistic point of view.
Yeah, it's radically different, and I wouldn't use the word translated into film. You know, I'm even reluctant to use the word adapt a novel or a work of fiction into film. It's such a radically different medium than fiction writing is, and that a work of fiction is. So that, but I have worked, you're right. I mean, I've worked on a number of different ways and levels with it, written screenplays too for different people. I adapted film for On the Road at one point for Francis Coppola, and I've written several other film screenplays and some of my own, adapting some of my own work as well. And so I'm very engaged by the process. But I realize it's as different from writing fiction as being a potter is, or a collagist or something. Just in an utter different medium entirely. The few parallels that exist are relatively insignificant almost, and so it's not just you can't really adapt or translate a novel to film, I don't believe. You've got to go into a novel or a long story or whatever work of fiction you might be engaging if you're a filmmaker, and pillage it, take out of it the elements that might make a good movie and forget the rest. And mm-hmm. Because most of what's in a work of fiction is absolutely useless in a film. And that's a radical kind of disjunction that the writer, the screenwriter has to be willing to go through. And if the screenwriter happens also to be the writer of the work of fiction, it gets a little complicated and a little difficult maybe sometimes. But I've been able to do it okay, and by mainly making sure that I separate the two kinds of work we're doing. I like to compare it sometimes to a novelist works alone, you know, and like a potter, and just makes out of a lump of clay a three-dimensional object we call a novel or a short story or whatever, and it's, you know, it all by himself or herself, and that's it. And then along comes the filmmaker and takes that pot, that three-dimensional rounded object that was made by one person in a room by himself or herself, and throws it on the floor and smashes it into 1,000 pieces, and then picks out of the pile the pieces that might be reassembled into a two-dimensional object, like a stained glass window or something, and it has nothing to do with the object. And then there's a collaboration that you bring in the person who makes the frame for the window, you bring in the person who does the leading, and you reassemble it into a whole other narrative, a whole other form. And so the difference is that radical.
So you've gotten a lot of people now asking questions about your writing process, and you've brought up now using the idea of the writer and the potter is solitary and things like that. Some of our attendees are asking, what is your writing process? Like, how do you even just start your day? How do you just sit down at 9 o'clock and start to read, and you have a word count that you try and reach? Or are you feverish in your writing process? What is it like?
Okay, we're talking nuts and bolts here, right?
Yeah, we're getting right into it.
You know, it's varied, and I have to say, you know, it's varied over the years, depending upon my financial, familial, social circumstances, really. When I was young, and I mean really young, in my late teens, early 20s, and just beginning, and it was just me, my dopey life, and, you know, part-time job, trying to survive, pay the rent by myself. And I had endless energy, the energy of a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old, and so on. Then you know, then I probably worked all the time, you know, and I stole a few hours here or there in order to make enough money to pay the rent and put food on the table for myself. But later, of course, I had a family, and I had a more complicated life, personal, familial life, and needed to have a paying job, and had growing children, and so I found myself writing late at night. I had to go to work in the morning, and I had to make breakfast for the kids and take out, and then they come back, and then the evening would suddenly be 8 o'clock at night, and before I could actually be free to write, and then I would write until 2 in the morning. But I was still young, and I still had all that crazy physical and mental energy. And then I got
Are there like ways that you see yourself, like, oh, you know, some people may have like little rituals that they do that help them steer them toward that writing time. Do you have anything like that? Like, you know, you go for a walk. Some people go for a walk, then they come back, they sit down, and their mind is fresh, and they just start writing. Or
no, I'm not too bound to any little rituals like that. I know Hemingway used to sharpen his pencils before he began to work, and he'd have 10 pencils out there and sharpen them all, and then that would put him in, I guess, what you would call a meditative state that would allow you to do the work. We all probably have little things we touch in order to get ourselves into that head. I'm sure I do too. I always work in places that are far from, or at least as far from the life of the household as I can get. I have a studio and a house in the mountains in the Adirondacks that's an old converted, renovated sugar shack. That's about 1,000 yards from the house in the woods, and I go to work there every day almost as if I had a real job. And I go out in the morning after breakfast, and that's where I am until mid-afternoon. And when I'm in the city, which is where I am now in Saratoga Springs, I have a room in the basement, windowless. I don't like or need to look out a window because that's another distraction. And I enter that every morning the same way that I enter my studio up in the Adirondacks, and work there. Pretty much the same routine after breakfast until mid-afternoon. And I'm alone, and I don't have any music or sound or anything else around me. and I don't, or I shut off emails, and I don't have any other communications coming in. So I'm free to just be in the world of fiction that I'm working on, and as much as possible without any interruption.
And you know, to write something like Foregone, which is about an era and about a time, do you find yourself having to do a lot of research or read other books of the time by other writers to sort of get a feel, to understand a little bit more, to help you? Is that something, it's not just creative right out of your head. There's a
Right.
lot of research in it.
There is, in this case, there was a mix. I mean, some books require much more research than others. I mean, a long novel, a historical novel like Cloud Splitter, which is set in the 1840s and 50s about the abolitionist John Brown, required a great deal of research, where I really had to basically become a historian almost, or a biographer, and know as much as would be required. Something else much more contemporary and much more drawn from my own personal life obviously requires much less. But in this book, you know, it was somewhere in the middle between the two. I knew a lot already when I began this book about the history of the anti-war movement, and also I knew a lot about Canada. I spent a lot of time there. I'm back and forth all the time. I have a lot of Canadian friends. I keep track of the world there. But I still needed to know a lot about the draft dodgers and deserters who went there in the 60s and 70s, and I didn't know a hell of a lot about it. It was, and there wasn't a lot there. There was a number of books been written about it, most of them in Canada, but not much else. But something that becomes, for instance, significant in the novel. There's an event that took place in '69 when the Americans were in Canada, and there was a gigantic and fabulous folk concert in Toronto, and Joan Baez arrived to sing and to present herself to the to the Americans who were there in Canada to protest, to avoid going to Vietnam, and she denounced them to their shock and dismay and sad disappointment. A woman they expected, the queen of the anti-war movement, arrives, and instead of praising them, she denounced them and said they all should have stayed in the United States and gone to prison like her husband, David Harris, who was then in prison. She was pregnant at the time as well, making it even more somehow a denunciation from an adored mother figure. Although I wonder how she would feel about being called that, but she was certainly seen as that by these young men. And she denounced them from the stage. And that was a case where I knew that it had happened, only because it was also a big issue on the left in the United States at the time. Like whether you should go to Canada, be a deserter, be a refugee, or you should stay here like David Harris and go to jail and somehow stop the war by being imprisoned for opposing the war. And it was a significant ideological issue at the time. I had to do some research on that because I don't think many people are aware of that particular issue and the meaning of it, the implications of it. They were big. If those 60,000 Americans had stayed home and gone to prison instead, it might have ground the war to a halt. They were almost all middle class. Their parents would not have permitted it. Yeah. And it might have really altered. I mean, Joan Baez wasn't necessarily wrong. And so something like that I had to research. It was very hard to find. I really tried to find a film, a video of that concert. And there is one that exists apparently, although I couldn't dig it out. The CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, commissioned a film of that concert, but it's somewhere lost in their archives and they've never digitalized it. So I couldn't get my hands on it. I had Canadian friends looking for it. I just so wanted to see that film where she stood on the stage and denounced these Americans.
I'll get my team working on it. You know, I'll get our research librarians working on it. If we
Good.
find it, I'll let you know, Russell.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of other questions here. So a lot of people here I see are writers and they want to understand more about your writing style. So here's a question from someone. Can you speak of your choices regarding POV? How you choose them and how you moved between them. She's wanting to talk about Foregone and the use of the memory that is very clear when they're in the room during the documentary shooting as they're filming him. But then when he goes back into his life, you know, then you're shifting that POV and I mean, it's seamless and amazing. And so she goes on to ask, can you speak to your choice to not use quotation marks and how to move fluidly between dialogue and narrative? And by the way, she said she loved the book. So
I'm happy for that question and thank you for liking the book, of course, but that you got it and you got the difficulty of trying to simultaneously present an objective reality and a totally subjective reality. And that was the difficulty in writing this book, because on the one hand, you have a character whose memories are being recorded, as it were, in the text from his perspective. It's third person, but very subjective, about as subjective as you can possibly get, and still be third person. It's present tense. And as you noted, and the questioner noted, there are no quotation marks around it, which makes it even more subjective and internalized. And alongside that, or coming in alternate chapters, is the more objective reality of the people in the black box room where they're filming him, who are going back and forth and talking amongst each other and trying to figure out what the heck he's telling them. Because what he's telling them seems gradually to be rather different from what he's remembering himself. He's going through something which is called by psychologists confabulation. He's confabulating the way people do in dementia, or they do under drugs, or in illness, or under medications and so forth. He's mingling together, or in dreams for that matter, mingling together real experiences, memories, dreams, other people's experiences, stories he's heard, films he's seen, and maybe even things he's invented. And so how to present all that together on the same page without losing context and without losing the narrative arc of it was really difficult. Point of view was crucial. And it wasn't, and I tried several different ways of telling this story, and it wasn't until I finally said, I think if I get really, really close, as close as I can possibly get without going into first person narrative, but keeping it third person. And if I can find ways to do that, then I think I might be able to pull this off. So to the person who's asked that question, that was how I came to do it in the present tense, third person, as intimate as possible, without making it into first person, to slide into first person. It was a very conscious decision. I hope it works. It sounds like it did for this reader at least, and I hope it works for others.
I actually felt that, you know, that because you got so close into the POV, close to Leo, that it almost felt like a play. And all the characters were right there on the stage, and any of his memories were kind of going to be behind a scrim somewhere on the stage.
Well, that's very good.
It was all sort of centered around him. Yeah. And it took me a while in the story to finally say, I want this to be a play. I'm going to put it on a stage, and I'm going to, you know, and that helped me with the POV because there was so much layering of memory. And then, as you were saying, confabulation, because then the morphine was getting a little stronger and a little stronger, but then there was also, he was in agony too. He was in pain. He was, you didn't know which was happening. And I thought that was,
You have to, and you start to sort of rely upon those who are in the black box, the little theatrical center of it, filming him, their responses and their confusion and so forth, to say, oh, wait a minute, what sounded just coherent as hell, where he was remembering something, doesn't sound coherent to them. So there must be a disjoint between the two. And you begin to reason your way through that. And I hope that about halfway through the book, you begin to get it all together. At least this is what people are beginning to tell me now. And because one of the pleasures of going out on the road, as it were, even though I haven't left my home to do it, is that you start to hear other people's responses to the book. And I think that they're beginning to get it in the way I hoped they would, which is making me very pleased and happy.
Russell, would you like to just, I know there's more questions, but do you want to read that page that you were telling me about, that you wanted to just?
Yeah, just kind of give you the
audience
voice
members,
maybe of it. There's in the first chapter, it's just the end of the first chapter. Just a page and a half is all it is, but it might give you some notion of how it starts, and then from there one can imply some of the rest. But you've described it, and we've been talking about it, so maybe there's enough of this to be clear. But here we go. This is the end of the first chapter. Malcolm, that's the documentary filmmaker who's directing this production, this last interview, says Fife's name and the date, April 1st, 2018, and location, Montreal, Quebec, and claps his hand once in front of Vincent's FS7. The camera is attached to a tripod on a track that orbits the circle of light on the bare floor and stares at the featureless, flat black side of Fife's face like the dark side of the moon. The unseen side is lit by the overhead spot. His silhouette has a molten golden edge, a penumbra surrounded by impenetrable black space. Malcolm is right. Fife still has a beautiful, brooding, bald head, at least in profile. The illness and chemo have dissolved a quarter of his body, liquefying his flesh, pushing forward the long arc of his nose and his cheekbones and prominent chin and the plates of his skull. He looks like a polished Roman coin. For a few seconds, everyone is silent, waiting for Malcolm's first question. But suddenly Fife says that he's going to answer a question that no one knows to ask today. The question, he says, is simply this: why did you decide in the spring of 1968 to leave the United States and migrate to Canada? For nearly 50 years, he's been answering that question, creating and reaffirming the widespread belief, at least among Canadians, that Leonard Fife was one of the more than 60,000 young American men who fled to Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s in order to avoid being sent by the US military to Vietnam. Those 60,000 men were either draft dodgers or deserters. For half a century, Leonard Fife was believed to be a draft dodger. It's what he claimed on the day he crossed the border from Vermont into Canada and asked for asylum. He's claimed it ever since that day. The truth, however, is always more complicated and ambiguous. Therefore, consider the preceding as merely a preface. For here begins Malcolm McLeod's controversial film, Oh, Canada. Although brilliantly shot and edited by McLeod and produced by his wife Diana in the late Leonard Fife's own manner, it is in some ways a disheartening, disillusioning film about Fife, one of Canada's most celebrated and admired documentary filmmakers. Oh, Canada shocked and disappointed the millions of Canadians who admired Leonard Fife for being one of those 60,000 Americans who fled north in the late 1960s to escape being sent by the American government to kill or die in Vietnam. While his filmed deathbed confession may have been cathartic for Fife himself, It has brought many Canadians to question their past and present national policy of offering asylum to so-called refugees. Refugees are people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution if they return home. They are assumed to have seen or experienced many horrors. A refugee is different from an immigrant. An immigrant is a person who chooses to settle permanently in another country. Refugees are thought to have been forced to flee. Leonard Fife claimed to be a refugee. That's how the first chapter ends. But you see, it also brings into the story the whole theme of refugees versus immigration too, which is today, both in Canada and the United States, a significant issue. We have to remember that the current Premier of Canada, Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the Premier during the period of this novel's start, 1960s, 68, 70s. And he declared these young men to be refugees, not immigrants, and refused to extradite them to the United States. So the whole question of refugee and what is a refugee and versus what is an immigrant, which today, certainly in the last 5 or 6 years, we have been grappling with and are still and will be grappling with for the next, who knows how long, decades.
So we actually, it's interesting you bring that up, because there are two questions people are asking. One is a former student of yours. You were a professor. His name is Bradford Durrell, and he asked,
I remember Brad Durrell. Yes, many years ago.
well, he says you were my professor in the late 70s in New Hampshire, and you look great for 81.
I'll bet he looks better.
His question is, how do you feel draft dodgers, about draft dodgers philosophically, if you want to go more about that. But his other questions are, okay for Vietnam War due to moral objections, but what about other recent US conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan? Does it depend on the war? By the way, and then he goes on saying that you were his professor. But I think he's bringing up the refugee immigrant situation that you're talking about, that Leon Fife and the novel.
Well, these are terribly difficult and important questions, moral questions, which we rarely ask ourselves about today, but which I think we asked ourselves about much more aggressively in the late 60s and 70s. Is it justifiable to refuse to serve in a war that you disapprove of, that you are opposed to? And I feel that yes, it is, of course, justifiable to refuse to serve, but you have to, of course, accept the consequences of that act. And the consequences might be that you go to prison as a result. And then you have learned something very important about the nature of your state and its power. But this is a question of private morality versus public morality, and it's endless. I mean, it's not something that only existed. That question only existed because of the Vietnam War, and as Brad brought forward, it existed in the war in Iraq. It existed. It exists to this moment. If you're drafted today and you're asked to go to participate in a war that you have absolute opposition to, what's your response? Well, you can oppose that. You just simply have to accept the consequences of that, and in so doing, learn from that, if you didn't already know it, the power of the state to imprison you for that, and you will go to prison.
Another patron, Joan Gazzetti, brings up also how you would use the terms draft dodger and deserter, but there are also many people who oppose the Vietnam War or just war in general for religious reasons.
Right.
And that's just something she wanted to point out, and not just deserters or draft dodgers. It was that they had a moral, again, what you were saying, very moral, and it was a religious belief
Right. There were at those times much easier ways to obtain alternative service. You could work in a hospital. My friend Dan Halpern, who's been with me actually in my pod during the pandemic here, and editor, poet, publisher. He was in the same era. He was opposed to going to Vietnam, but he was opposed to war, and so he took alternative service, and he worked in a hospital in Los Angeles during that period for 3 years. This was possible. To the degree that it's possible today, I'm not so confident to declare conscientious objection. But that's what it is. That's what she's referring to.
Right, right. Muhammad Ali, or
yeah, one could
still
still do it.
or Muhammad Ali,
yeah, you're
conscious
not,
objector to it. Yeah, yeah.
right. And you're going to pay a price for that. I mean, there is always a price for it. What the price is showing you, though, is the power of the state. And that's something we're sometimes not that conscious of, or except in a kind of paranoid and conspiratorial way conscious of it, and that's hardly what I would call consciousness, but still, I mean, this is what brings it home to you. If you're a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, and you're drafted into the military to fight a war you have absolutely no belief in and you're totally opposed to, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And there are pathways, but in each
Yeah.
case, what's being defined for you is the power of the state.
So I'm going to switch away a little bit about all the draft dodging and all of
Yeah, because it's really about dying and mortality.
and we're going to come back to some of the last few questions that the patrons have asked. But I wanted to let you know that next month I have Nancy Pearl coming to yeah, she's to the library to introduce her book, The Writer's Library. And so just letting everyone know, she'll be here next month. The Writer's Library is a book. She's a librarian, but some of you may know her from Book Lust with Nancy Pearl. She has a radio show on NPR, and she talks about books and everything. Anyway, she wrote this book. She went around the country, maybe even around the world. No, I think it was just around the country, and talked with writers about just themselves and about their writings. And she's made this nice little book. And she asked them, what are the books that changed their lives? Anyway, Russell Banks is in the book. And at the beginning of the chapter, she says, he is one of my favorite writers of all time. I just thought I'd tell you that. Anyway, so I read the chapter, and it was really very interesting. There's some interesting things. So I'm just going to bring out some things that I think the audience would find interesting about you, and that she put into the book. So you grew up in New Hampshire. It says here you grew up in New Hampshire, and that you went to a 2-room school of only 8 grades. Yeah. And what was that like?
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. And I look back, I mean, it's a small town, Barnstead, New Hampshire. 8 grades, 2 teachers, probably 4 kids or 3 kids or 5 kids in each grade. And depending upon your ability and level of literacy, I guess, you were not put into a specific grade. You were put in with the kids who were at the same level as you were. And since I could read when I got to school, I was put into the 3rd grade with the other kids who had started to read. And you were moved according to your ability. These were great teachers. I mean, you think back to this is the 1940s now, we're talking mid-1940s, 1946, 47, 48. And these women, and they were all women, were brilliant, wonderful, loving people. So, I don't know, so sensitive and intelligent and loving, I must say. And they just brought you along as if you were their nephews and nieces, at your own speed, your own ability. It was the best educational experience I probably could have had. They realized early on I was a clever kid and loved to read about the world that was larger than the world we were in, Barnstead, New Hampshire, and directed me immediately to the Oscar Foss Memorial Library in Barnstead, New Hampshire, which was a little one-room Carnegie brick library that they had in all across America in small towns. Because they had a collection of National Geographic magazines. And they said, Russell, this is what you should be reading, National Geographic magazines. And so a little second grader, third grader, while I waited for the school bus, I went over to, they gave me time off from my class to go over early and hang out at the library and read. But they were free to do things like that and take a bright kid and bring him out. And in the fourth grade, I got, when my family moved to Concord, New Hampshire, which was a little bit larger city, 25,000 people, in a bigger school suddenly, an elementary school, classic elementary school of the era. The teacher, I was so advanced over the kids who were in the fourth grade in this school, from this little two-room school with 8 grades and 2 teachers, that the teacher didn't know what to do with me. So she took me out of her class, fourth grade, and put me in the hallway, and she got the janitor to build a 8-foot by 8-foot plywood table on sawhorses, and gave me about 20 pounds of plaster of Paris and said, now I want you to make a topographical map of Brazil, and I want you to learn everything about Brazil and paint it into this about the forests and the rivers and the raw materials and the population and this, that, and the other, and the rivers. So, and this is your project. So I spent the entire fourth grade out in the hallway building a model of Brazil, which completely kept me out of trouble and probably made her classroom a lot more peaceful because I was gone. But that kind of teaching, you know.
Yeah, you just don't find that kind of teaching. I mean, maybe there is out there, but
yeah.
that's pretty priceless. I'm seeing we're coming up to our end of our hour, but I just have 3 more questions from the audience. Going back to your writing skills, your writing life, do you have a quota for how much you need to write in a day? Do you use a spreadsheet to outline how your story is going to go? Do you create those types of things?
You know, I actually do have a goal. I try to write 1 page a day, every day. And then that way in a year, I have 365 pages. And that's a draft of a novel. And if I can do 1 page, I often do more than a page. I rarely do less. And so, but my goal is simply just do 1, and then you don't feel guilty the rest of the day. And that's it. I don't work with spreadsheets or big formal outlines or you know, of any kind. I try to know where I'm going for the next sequence of scenes, maybe 20, 30 pages ahead of me, and I try to have a vague idea of where the story or novel is aimed. Is it aimed toward a funeral? Is it aimed toward a wedding? Is it aimed toward a cataclysm, or is it aimed toward a peaceful denouement? I try to have some sense of that. But overall, the long arc is one that I hold with great flexibility and say, I can go this way, I can go that way, and not worry about it. The short arc, the next 20, 30 pages or so, are a little more constricting and rigid for me. But beyond that, I want to stay open to improvisation and to impulse and to discovery as I go.
So there's a woman who, it was the very first question of the night, and she's been very patient. I'm sorry, but could you please discuss the title of the book, Foregone?
Yeah, it's a complicated title. I had several different titles on this book. Usually I can get a title early on, but in this case I couldn't get it. Then I finished the book and I had a list of titles. None of them satisfied me. None of them worked. And and I went back and I reread the book, which is kind of a ghost in this book. You know, I think every literary work that's serious and ambitious has a kind of ghost in the works, a novel or a story or some work of art that lurks in the background and informs the writer, whether consciously or not, it's still there. And in this case, it was the great novella by Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I knew it was there. And we went back and read it again, probably for the fifth time. And there's a moment in there where Ivan Ilyich, the character, says, I want, he's dying. He's at the end of his moments, end of his days, the last moments of them. And he says, I wanted to say forgive, but all I could say was foregone. And I thought, that's right, it's foregone. Somehow that cuts to the heart of this story, and it has a resonance for me. I know we say foregone conclusions is the main way we use it today in conventional conversation, but it has a deeper and darker and more spiritual significance, I think, than that. And so I plucked that out of the Ivan Ilyich, Death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy's story, and used it as a title. And it still seems to me the right one.
And so now there's also the question, so have you started another book? But the real question is, out of all the books that you have written, do you have a favorite book that you really enjoyed writing?
Well, you know, you always say, and writers have said this forever, oh, the book that matters the most to me is the one I'm working on now. Well, that's a certain amount of truth to that. But then you look back over at my age, certainly, and you've got 20 or 30 books to look at and say, well, this is the one I favor. And you end up favoring one that probably nobody else likes for the very reason that nobody else likes it or pays any attention to it or somehow ignores or forgot about it or something. And I wrote a short novel back in the 70s called The Relation of My Imprisonment, and which is a very poetic novel in many ways. And it had a difficult publishing history. Nobody wanted, I was publishing at that time at Houghton Mifflin and in a fairly, you know, comfortable and ongoing way, but they didn't want to touch it. And then I went to HarperCollins and they didn't want to deal with it either. It's only about 150, 200 pages long. But I loved the little book. And suddenly a small magazine published on mimeograph paper, stapled together, called United Artists in the Lower East Side of New York, said, we love this book. Poets, they were. Bernadette Mayer and her husband Louis Warsh, and they said, can we serialize this? And I said, oh yeah, that sounds cool. And so they serialized it in this little magazine. It found a few readers. They were mostly poets. And it gradually came back. And then another small press published a little edition of it. And then now it's Echo, HarperCollins has it in print, and it's got ongoing, continuing life. Has been translated into a lot of languages and very popular in France. But in a way, it's
wonderful.
It's like having a child who, like, everybody thought was the dumb kid, you know, the one who had problems or whatever.
Oh,
and it turns out that kid has got genius. and so, yeah, that's my favorite book, but it's for those kind of reasons.
Oh, that's dear. That's a very. So yes or no to the very last question. Just a yes or no answer, because I know you could go long on this, but let's just do a yes or no. Should the Selective Service registration be abolished?
Oh boy. I have to say no, but.
Okay, no, but.
Has to include women.
Ah, okay. Okay.
Then I think they'll change it.
My very last question is actually what I got from Nancy Pearl, and that is this. You thought that you would become a visual artist. What visual artist? Was it painter? Was it graphic art? What was your medium when you were thinking, before you became a writer, you were thinking of becoming a visual artist?
Well, I wanted to be a painter, and that was what I thought I could do. I had that skill. I mean, it was music and art, if you can demonstrate it early on in life, the way you can't if you're going to be a writer. Literary skill doesn't really reveal itself early on the way a kind of precociousness in visual art and in music does, and mathematics and a few other things. But I had that, and it did, and I could draw. I had great hand-eye skill at that time, and so I wanted to become a painter. I didn't know anything about it, and then it lasted into my late teens or early 20s, that ambition, desire. And then it got displaced by my literary ambitions, by falling in love with literature, really. I fell in love with writing, with reading. I shouldn't even say I fell in love with writing. I fell in love with reading in my late teens, early 20s, and that's what turned me into a writer.
Well, that's going to be the last bit from Russell Banks. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Laura, thank you too. It's been a great evening.
Thank you, everyone who has come to listen to Russell. Thank you for your questions. Have a very good night, everyone.